Freedom. Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation. For it comes only once to a people. Not only is this quote by President Reagan an excellent segue to the debate at hand, but it's also a very opportunistic moment to say that it's on Joe Biden's birthday. Thank you, Gene. Also, happy birthday to you. And thank you, Reason Foundation and the Soho Forum for making all of this possible. Also, thank you Fundacion Free and Enlaces for supporting me throughout this event. And I'd also like to give you a thanks, the audience, watching here live and watching from home, for supporting this type of event. So thank you so much. First, I'd like to introduce myself very briefly. My name is Santiago Forster. I study international business and international affairs at Northeastern University. I'm a senior there, and I'm a classical liberal by conviction. Also, simultaneously, I'm a supporter of free enterprise and commerce, and I think that Milei is doing a very good job in improving tangible measurements in the economy. Also, I happen to work in corporate taxes simultaneously, and I'm an Argentine American. So I'd also like to thank Agustín for coming all the way from Argentina. I'd like to give a little brief introduction of him. Agustín is 33 and the member of the oldest party in Argentina. And when they governed, they created hyperinflation. I'm 21 and defending the economic policies of a party that has governed for less than a year. I guess experience isn't everything on a resume, Agustín. So, first off, I'd like to make a clear distinction. Agustín's line within the party, the Unión Cívica Radical, is even further left than the most of the party. He responds to Martín Lustó. Martín Lustó is the former Minister of Economy of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, and I'm going to get into all of this. But one thing that I want everyone to understand is that the Unión Cívica Radical, on Agustín's line of the party, is for hyperinflation and is for increasing taxes. They tried to promote with Lustó the Ley 125, Law 125, to increase taxes on the agro industry. So, and that didn't pass back in 2007, 2008. That didn't pass. They weren't successful in doing that. But that is what they want to do when they have the power to do so. So, first, I'd like to, and also, one quick thing. That is not against everyone who is a radical, everyone who is within his party. There is also a branch of that party that is helping Milei liberate Argentina's economy. So I want to give those people merit as well, the people within Agustín's party who are helping, but Agustín and his boss, unfortunately, aren't on that side. So I'd like to define the terms and the model for this debate. So the terms are the following. Let me start with a resolution real quick to remind you one more time. Free market President Javier Milei of Argentina has been making tangible progress toward improving the Argentinian economy. All right, so who is Javier Milei? Javier Milei is an anarcho-capitalist, self-defined, and he rose to fame going to TV shows and speaking about economics on those shows. He was very passionate, he had a bravado to him, and that's what appealed to the masses. And in a runoff election, when he presented himself as president in a context of hyperpolarization in Argentina, when he presented himself to be president of Argentina, they went on a runoff election between him and Peronist candidate Sergio Tomás Massa, the minister who created the highest inflation in the recent 20 years, and Milei won with 56% of the popular vote in that runoff election, giving him a clear economic mandate from the people to make radical economic change. Then, what is the free market? The freer the market, the freer the people. That's the logic behind that. Deregulation and its decentralization. And it is essentially putting monetary and fiscal and structural changes at the forefront and reducing obstacles in those three pillars of the economy. Then, what is tangible progress in the economy? That's another part we have to unpack from this resolution. Tangible progress is improving the economic indicators of the three legs that I just mentioned: fiscal, monetary, and structural or institutional, however you want to call it. And in doing so, you improve the lives of the middle and vulnerable classes and all Argentines. Then I want to just say what my model of a country is. It's exactly that. It's improving those metrics. It's making people's lives easier, making business people do commerce in an easier fashion, as the advanced Western civilized world does in a normal society. And Agustin's model, as I mentioned, is a model of a country that suffers from hyperinflation, as they did when they also governed in the 80s after our military dictatorships, where we reached 3,000% hyperinflation under Raúl Alfonsín, which was from his party. And seriously, given these pillars, I'll provide a brief economic history of Argentina now. In the early 20th century, we were a global leader in the economy. Our wages were some of the highest in the world. Our GDP per capita was the highest in the world. And in terms of nominal GDP, we rivaled every advanced nation in the world. One coincidence is we didn't have a central bank back then. Then in the 1930s came the centralization of the Argentine economy, and we created the central bank. In doing so, our monetary base expanded significantly, and this, in my opinion, was the first signs of an economy that was going to suffer in the following decades, because then in the 40s and the 50s, Juan Domingo Perón came to power and installed a social welfare state in which massive programs were funded through fiscal deficit, through the expansion of the monetary base, and in doing so, deficit spending reached unsustainable levels, and by 1952, it had reached 38% inflation. That's the highest recorded ever by that time in Argentina. Then, in the 60s and 70s, instability and hyperinflation with our horrible military regimes came into place. These military regimes committed human rights violations, but also they were very poor in managing the economy. And what happened here is that they had a state corporatist style of economic governance, and hyperinflation reached 444% in 1976 under the military dictatorships. After that, market reforms and missed opportunities came along when actually before, in the 1980s, after the military dictatorships, we had Raúl Alfonsín, the father of democracy, and in that regard, no one questions that, but in economic policy, he flunked. He flunked because the fiscal deficit ballooned, debt became unsustainable, and as I mentioned, inflation reached 3,000% in 1989. And I want to mention one thing here. In this government, Rodolfo Terraño, which was the Minister of Public Works and Services of the Radical Party, what he did was he tried to privatize firms towards the end of Alfonsín's government, showing a hypocrisy in their way of economic governance. On the one hand, they did very poor fiscal and monetary policy, expanding the monetary base and ballooning the fiscal deficit. But on the other hand, they tried to save themselves by privatizing firms at the end of Alfonsín's government, which wasn't even successful because the Peronists blocked that. And then in the 90s, Menem came along. Menem was a Peronist, but he governed as a classical liberal. So what happened is that there were missed opportunities here as well, and Menem tried to do free market reforms, pegged the dollar to the peso to 0% inflation yearly, and what happened there was that Menem relied too heavily on foreign investment, and he also did not carry out the appropriate fiscal policies, and public spending remained high, unemployment hit 25%, and GDP shrank by 20% under Menem. But then that segued over to the Corralito, the 2001 crisis, which was one of the gravest crises in Argentina's history. After that, we had the Kirchner legacy, which the Kirchners governed Argentina for basically the last 20 years. Inflation under their governments averaged 20 to 30% annually, but the real beauty was when they governed the last 4 years before Milei, and inflation reached 113%. And JP Morgan had estimated that if they had won the election, inflation was going to reach 190% last year. 190% last year. So, deficits funded by money printing destroyed purchasing power while poverty climbed over 40% during their last government, corruption and cronyism flourished, and now we have Milei. So, what is Milei doing, and what are the arguments that sustain his economic policy and why he's making tangible progress in the economy? I'll break it into three main arguments. The first would be monetary. The second would be fiscal. And the third would be institutional or structural, however you want to call it. It's the same. So, starting with monetary. What has Milei done in the monetary sphere? Here I'd like to start with a phrase that Milei repeats a lot, and it is the following: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So the point is that the central bank was stabilized and zero money issuance was carried out so far in Milei's government. The central bank was stabilized because reserves increased to $30.282 billion thanks to policies that strengthened trade balance and eliminated inflationary instruments like remunerated liabilities. And then zero monetary issuance was very important from reducing monthly inflation from 25.5% monthly to only 2.7% monthly currently. 25.5% a year ago with Massa and Cristina Kirchner, 2.7% currently. That is the result of good economic monetary policy. Then the fiscal. In the fiscal argument, I'd like to present another quote that adds on to the quote that Milei likes to use. And this quote is the following. Thomas Sargent, a very famous economist, said, "Persistent inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon." Persistent inflation. So what does this mean? It builds off Milei's favorite quote, because over time, if you have poor fiscal policy, then that will create a long-lasting situation for inflation to be pervasive over decades. The point here that I'm trying to make with fiscal policy is that Milei achieved financial equilibrium in record time, there were twin surpluses, the public spending was reduced, and taxes were announced to be reduced as well. My evidence for this? Well, in the first point, there were twin surpluses for the first time in a long time, fiscal financial surplus of 0.4% of the GDP, and primary surplus of 1.7% of the GDP. This eliminated net borrowing and monetary financing from the central bank. Also, public spending reduction. So what happened in public spending? 30%, over 30% of public spending was reduced during Milei's government. That's super important because why? When Milei started, there were 18 ministries. Ministries would be the equivalent of a department in the US government, so like State Department, for example. There were 18 ministries, and Milei reduced them to 8. So that was a reduction of 10 ministries as soon as he got into power. And then 22,000 public sector employees were eliminated from the workforce. So all this public spending alleviated the fiscal situation quite a lot, the lack of public spending. And then there was an announcement to reduce the Impuesto País, which the Impuesto País is one of the most grave taxes in Argentina, 17.5% tax rate, among many other taxes, being imposed on the business people of Argentina. And it has been announced that by December, there will be a reduction to 7.5% of this tax rate. So that's next month. And what happens here? I don't know if you're familiar with the Laffer curve, but Dr. Laffer, who is also a mentor of mine and a very dear person in my life, I think that his theory with the Laffer curve is fantastic in this context. Why? Argentina was not even on the Laffer curve from how many taxes we were charging our business people and our regular citizens. The Laffer curve, just for context, indicates government revenue and the ideal point of taxation. So Argentina's taxes were so high that we were being inefficient in creating government revenue. People were evading taxes. So I just want people to understand that when there is an announcement to reduce taxes in this way, this is fantastic in this context. And then lastly, in this context as well, BBVA, which BBVA is a very prestigious bank in Argentina and many other countries, estimates a growth of 6% of the GDP in 2025, while JP Morgan just today announced a forecast of 8.5% growth of the economy in 2025 in Argentina. This is a miracle after the necessary contraction of 4% as a result of the abysmal fiscal and monetary inheritance left by Cristina Kirchner and Sergio Massa to Milei. It's a miracle that Argentina is being projected to grow at the rate that it's being projected so next year, 2025. Then I'd like to give some institutional and structural arguments real quick. First, labor and administrative reform was done, and under the ley bases, privatizations, public employment reforms, and administrative procedures, modernizations were introduced. So this is very important. Why? Because these measures aim to reduce state discretion and encourage private investment. Then deregulation of transportation and commerce was done, which is also important for sectors like agribusiness, aviation, and more. And this was all done under the new ministry created. 10 were eliminated, but one had to be created, which is called Ministry of Deregulation and Transformation of the State. So, thank you. So then, one more thing. I want to address a point that Agustín is probably going to bring up, which is, just in case, to tackle the argument that the middle class and the most vulnerable are being forgotten, I want to mention a couple things as to why I think they're not. There's been controlled inflation. Inflation is a thievery, it's a robbery of people's purchasing power. So that's very important for the middle class and the vulnerable classes. Second, there has been increased social benefits. So people, for example, pensions have been adjusted above the inflation rate. And third, targeted social policies. People are being capacitated to depend less on the state and on social welfare and be reintegrated back into the job market, all under this new administration. So I want to remind people, sadly, how confused and contradictory the Unión Cívica Radical is, unfortunately, and that when they had the chance to govern with Alfonsín and Lustó, they governed with hypocrisy and mostly against common sense economics. But Agustín, if you want to join Milei's space, I'm sure your talents could be better used with him. I'm sure that if you want to embrace free market capitalism, he'll accept you in his space. So, yeah. And thank you.
Time's up.
And with that, I'd just like to close and say that I think this has been enough burden of proof to show how Javier Milei's government has made tangible progress in the Argentine economy. Thank you.